Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. This is where I would usually have a pregame video for this Philadelphia game coming up, but we play on Monday night, which means that we're still a few days away. It means we don't even have a final injury report yet. We need more information before I can make a pregame video. So the pregame video will be in a couple of days here, once we have the full slate of information. So this video, I want to talk a little bit more about this Seattle Seahawks organization big picture. I want to talk a little bit more about the big picture in Seattle right now, and I want to address one of the narratives that I'm hearing concerning the Seattle Seahawks and where they are right now, because it doesn't look like it's going to be a good season. They could turn it around if they win out. That's a 10 win season. That's going to be a playoff spot almost certainly, and that is going to be by some definition improvement over last year. But anything short of that, it's going to be a team that is at best stuck in neutral, and more likely is a team that is going the wrong direction. And everybody's dealing with that in their own way. But while there are a lot of people out there who are definitely using that as an opportunity to go after Pete Carroll, and I'm certainly one of those people, there's one narrative from the people who are a little more defensive of Pete Carroll who say some version of the following. And I want to go ahead and address that now because I think it misses the mark. Like, I think a lot of the points that people make trying to defend Carroll say, which is we're in a rebuild. This is year 2 of a rebuild. You shouldn't be upset that we're having a bad season because when you decide to do things like trade your franchise quarterback for draft picks, you know it's going to be lean for a little while. And the fact that we were a decent team last year, we won 9 games, made the playoffs, should not distract from the fact that overall there is a rebuild going on here and we need to be patient through a bad season. And on the surface, that sounds like a perfectly coherent and valid argument to me. On the surface, yeah, that's a really good point. But like many things that people say to try to defend Pete Carroll, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And if you really break down the decision making that this team has partaken in since trading Russell Wilson, you'll see a clear contradiction. And that contradiction is best marked by the fact that when Pete Carroll came out at the combine right after trading Russell Wilson to the Broncos, one of the big talking points in that press conference from him was, I don't even know how to rebuild. This is not a rebuild. So I encourage everybody who watches this video to go find the video. It's definitely on YouTube somewhere. I think on the official Seahawks channel, actually, of Pete Carroll talking about the direction of the Seahawks after the Wilson trade. I believe it was at the Combine that year where he said, we're not rebuilding. I don't even know what the word rebuild means, which is a really dumb thing to say, by the way. But he basically said, I don't do rebuilds. We're going to try to win. So just immediately, that narrative takes a huge hit because that's the head coach right there telling you, this is not a rebuild. Do not hold me to the standards of the rebuild. The goal is to win games. So right then and there, as far as I'm concerned, the argument's kind of dead in the water. But let's go further than that because sometimes words are just words. Sometimes a guy like a Pete Carroll will just say stuff and it doesn't mean anything, right? What about his actions? Let's think about some of the things the Seahawks have decided to do over the last year, well, 2 years now, basically, since the Wilson trade. We're talking, what, 20 months? Something like that? Let's look at some of the things they've done, because some of it, yeah, it tracks with the rebuild. But what about the decision to retain Quandre Diggs? He was a free agent going into that offseason, and not even a month, maybe it was a little bit more than a month, but right after the Wilson trade, one of the first things the Seahawks did in free agency was make sure they kept Quandre Diggs around. They gave him a 3-year, $39 million contract. So, look, no hate on Quandre Diggs. He had played well for several years in Seattle. He was a very good, very respected player. He deserved to get paid. But Quandre Diggs was an older player, and more importantly than that, maybe, he had just had a major injury that I think we've seen, even almost 2 years later, he has not completely gotten past. That injury is still haunting him. So, why would the Seattle Seahawks go into a rebuild and then say we're going to pay a bunch of money to a veteran safety who just suffered a crippling injury? Why would they do that? Like, I know he was on the right side of 30 when that contract kicked in, but he's on the wrong side of 30 now, and we knew he was going to be on the wrong side of 30 pretty quickly after signing that deal. And we had already given a ton of money to Jamal Adams. So, we're rebuilding, but we're also investing a bunch of money into a veteran safety who had probably already had his best years. So, let me ask you, is doing something like retaining Quandre Diggs for $13 million a year for 3 years just before he hits 30 something that a rebuilding team does? Or is it a team that is pushing everything to the max to try to win games now does? I think we all know the answer to that. That's not the action of a rebuilding team. So we get through that season. Fast forward to the most recent offseason, the 2023 Seattle Seahawks offseason. What were some of the moves that the Seahawks made? Let's start with bringing back Bobby Wagner. Bobby Wagner, who had just finished up the, 11th year of his career, who had a ton of miles on him, who was obviously still a very good player, but the cliff was obviously coming. Like, Bobby Wagner is not going to be some elite linebacker going into his 40s. That's not something that happens. Arguably, he was already past his prime. I do suspect that he was. And depending on who you ask, by the way, Wagner hasn't even been good this year. Some people say he's been awful. Some people say he's been mediocre. I don't agree with those people, but there is an argument that he is a problem at the very least on this defense right now because he is so slow. But either way, even if Wagner is still good, why would you spend $5.5 million bringing in Bobby Wagner to quarterback your defense when you're in the middle of a rebuild? Wouldn't you give that responsibility to younger players? Wouldn't you try to figure out what you had with the younger guys? I think you would. That just seems like common sense to me, right? Like, what is Bobby Wagner going to do for you if you're going through a rebuild? Not much. Maybe he props your team up slightly, but he's not going to single-handedly make them good. And by the time you get out of the rebuild, Wagner's either going to be gone or retired. So why would you bring Wagner in on a 1-year deal if you're in the middle of a rebuild? Bringing in Wagner on that 1-year deal was the action of a team that's trying to win now. And then let's go forward a little bit more and remember all the restructuring the Seahawks did this offseason to their veterans. Tyler Lockett, Quandre Diggs, and Jamal Adams were all restructured to create extra cap space for 2023 at the expense of cap space in 2024 and 2025. Is that something a rebuilding team does? Kick the can down the road financially? Make decisions that hurt future you for the sake of current you? No, that's not something that a rebuilding team does. A rebuilding team tries to get that stuff over with so they can part ways with their aging veterans in a year or two and turn things over to the young crew. So there's another one. Like this team has not operated like a rebuilding team in many areas. There have been some areas, absolutely. They brought in a lot of young players. They've done a lot of things that do say rebuild. But these are not the actions of a team that is rebuilding. This is a team that is trying to do things to win now. And that doesn't even get into the big one. Lenny Williams. Remember this one? Leonard Williams? Just a couple months ago, you traded a second-round pick to get Leonard Williams, a guy who is about to turn 30 years old. A guy who has been a great player in this league, but is about to be due a monster contract. And you gave up a valuable asset for him. That second round pick is no joke. And I'm sure they knew it was a risk when they brought him in. I'm sure they were aware of the fact that the season could go badly and that second round pick would become really valuable. I'm sure they were aware that Leonard Williams is getting older. Who knows how much longer he's going to be able to keep this up. But you did it anyway. Would a rebuilding team trade a second round pick for a veteran defensive lineman? Absolutely not. That is a move that a team that is trying their best to win the Super Bowl now, or at the very least make a deep run at things to validate the current era. That is a move to win now at the expense of the future. So This talk about how this season is okay because of a rebuild, I would accept that if this was actually a rebuild. It's not. The Seahawks, I don't know if they looked at what happened last year and got really excited and thought they were really close, so they decided to make some go for it moves and it ended up not working out. Or maybe, I don't know if they never intended to rebuild and what happens, whether or not they win or lose, is just kind of random chance and variance, and they're just always going to do stuff like this to try to win now because that's their mentality. I don't know what it is, but either way, you cannot tell me this team is actually trying to rebuild. So I wanted to take a video to address this because it's a talking point that is being used to defend what this team is currently doing right now, to try to justify this bad season. And there's nothing wrong with having a bad season. Football teams have bad seasons all the time. Football teams have awful seasons sometimes. And it's part of the process. But when the process of having that bad season involves giving big contracts to veteran players who are probably right at the end of their prime, if not already past it, when that process involves making big trades for veteran players who are making a lot of money and about to be making a lot more, no, it's not a rebuild. And Pete Carroll does not deserve the excuse of, oh, well, this is year 2 of the post-Russell Wilson rebuild. If he had actually treated this like a rebuild, like maybe if he had just done one of these things, like just the Quandre Diggs extension, maybe then I would be more amenable to that, but not when you do all of this. So that doesn't fly with me. It shouldn't fly with you either. See you guys later. Go Hawks.